Hello and welcome to this special presentation right here on NDTV. Our guest today is someone whose work you're all too familiar with, the 2018 Jnanpith Award winner. He's a person who dabbles in fiction and non-fiction with equal facility. He's the one who told us about the Sea of Poppies, but he also told us about the Great Derangement. I have with me Mr. Amitav Ghosh. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here.
There's a new book, Smoke and Ashes, which is out now. It's released. In many of your interviews, Mr. Ghosh, you've been quoted as saying that this had a lot to do with your existing research plus new. That is part of the Ibis Trilogy. Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke and Flood of Fire. How should a reader place this book or this work by Amitav Ghosh? Is it part of the trilogy, like a sequel or a follow-up, or something totally different and new?
It's totally different. The trilogy was, of course, a series of novels, so it was completely fiction. All of it was, all the characters were fictional and so on. This is more about the background of the Ibis trilogy. So it's a completely different thing. It's not a novel, it's non-fiction, but it describes, my personal experience of writing the novel and my experience of doing the research and discovering this entire chapter of our history, which has been largely obscured.
Would you like to tell us what this chapter is? I mean, for our viewers who may not know what this book is all about. I read in a recent interview where again you were quoted as saying that India at least needs to acknowledge the role it played in, when an opium war was unleashed on the Chinese. Now, obviously, one would argue that that was not much of doing of Indians, but more of the British. So, would you like to tell us more about this?
Yes, certainly. So, what this chapter was is that this chapter was the opium trade, the opium industry, which was really, in many ways, economically the most important industry in India in the 19th century. It was a pillar of the Indian economy. It was a pillar of the British colonial economy, really. It's more accurate to say that that's what it was. It was a pillar of the British colonial economy. So the British were essentially exporting enormous quantities of opium to China. This opium was grown entirely in India. About half of it in the region that's known as Purvanchal. The other half in Malwa, which is sort of central and western India. So between these two regions, they were under colonial pressures, were producing huge quantities of opium. This opium was being exported to China, where there was an enormous addiction problem. So the Chinese tried to stop this trade. In 1839, they made an all-out effort to suppress the opium trade. And they would have succeeded, except what happened is that the British decided that opium was so essential to their economy that if China stopped importing it, their whole colonial economy would collapse. So they basically made war on China to make sure that China would continue to import opium. So yes, it's absolutely the case that the British were the prime movers in this. They were the prime movers in creating this gigantic opium industry in India. But it's also true that by that point, many Indians had become very important participants, in the opium trade, especially the merchants of Western India. And they were enthusiastic supporters of the opium war.
Because it brought business.
Yeah, it made them rich. So they provided ships for the British expeditionary fleet. And after the Opium War, many of them got compensation from the British. This includes, for example, Dwarkanath Tagore, who was Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather. So, many Indian merchants did participate. They grew rich from it. They were extremely eager participants. And I think that does need to be acknowledged. Even if India was not the main mover in this, They certainly played, India certainly played a major part because, the whole expedition was launched from India. And half the expeditionary force consisted of Indian sepoys.
I want to come to opium, drugs, and the problem here in India. Now, one of the things which has been mentioned in a recent interview by Mr. Shashi Tharoor is that India is the land of bhang and we must consider legalizing marijuana. I want to know what are your views about this?
I completely agree with him. Even when I was in my teens, I remember visiting friends who lived in villages, in eastern India and so on. And it was quite common. I mean, if you went...
it grows wild.
Yeah, I mean, the mother would bring you, a glass of bhang to welcome you. It was an ordinary part of hospitality. And India absolutely, historically, has been the land of marijuana. Marijuana was, as it were, the chosen psychoactive substance in India. And every culture everywhere has their own particular psychoactive substance, So I think, one has to make a distinction between levels of danger, posed by psychoactive substances. So the level of danger posed by marijuana is fractional compared to the level of danger posed by highly processed drugs like opioids, like cocainoids of various kinds. So, to imagine that you can stamp out all psychoactive substances is just a dangerous delusion. It led to this American war on drugs, which in fact rebounded terribly on America and created a catastrophe for them. Even in my 20s, 30s, there were legal outlets for marijuana. And then, under pressure from this American war on drugs, Indian authorities started removing them, which did nothing, in fact, to control the circulation of marijuana, because marijuana is a wild substance. It grows everywhere. You don't even really need to plant it. It's a very vigorous plant. It's one of the most vigorous plants that exists. It's as vigorous as bamboo. To imagine that you can stamp it out is just a dangerous delusion. And it criminalizes a lot of people who need not be criminalized. So I think, one has to pick one's battles.
Sure.
And this is, to try and suppress marijuana is the wrong battle. So I completely agree with Shashi.
Okay. Speaking of picking battles, let's talk about the other part which you try to address through your books, and that is climate change. There are many books on this. Now, I want to know from you that in The Nutmeg's Curse, the book argues that the dynamics of climate change today are rooted in centuries-old geopolitical order constructed by Western colonialism. Do you feel that this is exactly that curse which a country like India or the developing world is facing right now? And I'm saying this in the context of the developed world trying to tell the developing world that you've got to do more to address the issue of climate change because you are the polluter, completely forgetting that, they had a major role to play in the situation we are in.
I don't know that I would put that in the past tense. I mean, per capita, the rich countries contribute vastly more greenhouse gas emissions than countries like India or even China. Even now, the average, the per capita carbon footprint of India, Bangladesh, etc., is a tiny fraction of that of the affluent West. Which is not to say that many middle-class Indians have very large carbon footprints, but in general, the per capita carbon footprint of countries like India, Indonesia, and so on is tiny. Compared, the per capita carbon footprint of Ethiopia, one Ethiopian, is equivalent to one American fridge over 1 year. Can you imagine? And in America, people have fridges in every room.
Yeah.
So you can imagine how large just that, I mean, how large a contribution that
So
makes.
do you feel it's a bit rich for the Western world to basically
Absolutely.
ask the developing world to basically
It's absolutely the
be
case.
responsible for this problem?
Until the Western world starts drastically reducing their carbon footprint, nobody in the global South will reduce. You know, this is the crux of the problem. The developed world, the West, the global North, sees climate change fundamentally as a technological issue. You know, as a technological and scientific issue, and they think that by fiddling with some numbers, they can actually reduce the whole problem. But so if you ask anyone in the Western world, what is climate change, that's what they'll tell you. This is a techno-scientific problem that can be fixed through technological solutions. If you go to anyone in the global South and say, do you think you should reduce your carbon footprint, because of these problems? What they'll say to you is, why should we reduce our carbon footprint? The West grew rich when we were poor and weak, and now it's our turn. And it doesn't help to tell them that you are also under threat. It doesn't matter, because everybody knows that even Westerners are under threat from climate change. So this is the terrible dynamic. I mean, within the global South, everybody perceives climate change. Everybody perceives these problems
As someone else's problem.
No, it's seen as a geopolitical problem. In the West, it's seen as a technological problem. This is the fundamental difference.
But where do you stand on the issue, Mr. Ghosh, of, for instance, this is a case which India has been making, that the West and the developed countries must pay. They must invest heavily in technologies in the developing world to be able to fast track the process of, containing climate change.
I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree with that position. Of course they must pay. Because they've grown richer and richer by increasing their carbon emissions exponentially over the years. And actually they've used up, as it were, the atmosphere, which was, a good, these were the commons, that everybody had. And they've actually polluted the commons on this massive scale. So obviously, I mean, if they have these technologies, they must share them.
What's your view on India's track record on climate change?
So that's a different question. I think India's track record is terrible. I think we've made all these pledges and promises, which have actually no bearing on what is actually happening in the country. In India, but this is not specific to India. In fact, Britain, America, etc., also make these overweening promises, and then they continue to continue exploration for fossil fuels, for new sources of gas, of petrol, of coal. So they continue down that path, and they expect everyone else to change their ways. That's obviously not going to happen. If there is going to be any meaningful change on this, the Western world, the global North, first of all, needs to reduce its own carbon footprint. It needs to shut down its fossil fuel industries. You look at a country like Norway, which is so enormously rich. I mean, their per capita wealth is just unbelievable. They've already accumulated vast sums of money, because of their fossil fuels. They have no need to continue to expand their fossil fuel exploration. I mean, if anybody does not have a need, it's Norway, and yet they continue. They go on, So, what we are actually seeing is a race, is a race to the bottom. And this is the terrible, sad dynamic that is driving this.
And you feel in this context, perhaps meetings where people take pledges that we are going to do this or we are going to do that for the environment are just empty words. I mean, it's nice to sit and meet, but
these pledges are absolutely meaningless. This is what, I mean, that's why Greta Thunberg said, it's all just blah, blah, blah. And it is blah, blah, blah. Because say, for example, these carbon offsets. You can claim a carbon offset by planting a tree, But so everyone goes and plants a tree. And you have a monoculture of trees growing somewhere. A monoculture of trees is not the same thing as a forest. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
You know, a forest consists of many multi-species over, 200-300 year periods.
Yeah.
You know, so in fact, these carbon offsets probably do more damage than anything else. So every single thing that's posited as a solution, once you look at it carefully, you see that this is just blah blah blah.
There's one point related to this that I wanted to ask you about. You see, political immigration is something which always becomes a very big talking point. That there is a war somewhere, people are getting displaced, there are refugees, the global headlines. How would you respond to climate refugees? Let's take the example of Delhi. On the floodplains, thousands of people living, suddenly the river swells up and people are displaced. Similarly, across the world, because of climate change, there are many refugees all over the world. Do you think policymakers are even looking at this as a potential problem, as a big problem?
First of all, I would say that you're right. Policymakers are not dealing with this problem at all. But the second thing I would say is that I think that the term climate refugee is a very simplistic term. It reduces a multidimensional problem to something much more complex. So Bangladesh is a country from which many people are emigrating. I've actually I've done a lot of research on these migrants. I've interviewed them across the migrant camps in Italy, and it was a very interesting thing that many of them, because Bangladesh has a very high literacy, and also there's a very high awareness of climate change. They all know about the climate issues, but not a single refugee that I met would identify themselves as climate refugees. It's just not that simple. In the first place, there are many other kinds of incentives to emigrate. There are often these political and other identity problems involved. But most of all, I think the thing that we don't take into account in the migration issue is the part that social media plays. Social media and most of all communications technologies. These have become absolutely fundamental to the movement of refugees across the world. They pay their dalals through their phones. The movements are tracked, through their phones. So, even if you were to, even if there were no climate problem, I don't think that would end the migration issue.
Is this, Mr. Ghosh, why we see you making climate change a focal point of many of your books, because you feel very strongly about this? Do you feel that fictionalizing an issue like climate change is going to help you reach to a wider range of audience?
See, the issue is that, as Margaret Atwood, the novelist, famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. And I think there's a problem with always thinking about this in terms of climate change, because what we are seeing really all around us is a polycrisis. It's a multidimensional crisis in which climate change is just one factor. In fact, even more important than climate change may be biodiversity loss. Imagine if we lose all our insects, as is actually happening. In Europe, the population of insects has crashed by 75%. All human life is dependent upon bees, which pollinate our crops. So without that, we are really doomed. So, for example, biodiversity loss is incredibly important, and we're losing, various species at an incredible rate every day. So there's that problem. There's the migration crisis, which is actually quite separate from these other crises, even though they may play a part in them. There's the opioid crisis, which I think is also very much an accelerator of all of this. So all of these play into each other. So I wrote a novel I published a novel in 2016 called Gun Island, which is about, a lot of it is about migration. But, it's not about climate migration. It's not that simple. The problem is much, much more multidimensional.
Mr. Ghosh, do you feel that your novels are trying to, and your books, fiction and non-fiction, are trying to attract a reader's attention or people's attention more towards this very crucial issue, which, would you agree, is not treated as my problem or as your problem? It is always treated as, okay, this is someone's problem, it's big, people are speaking about, say for instance, if you compare it to an act of terrorism, right, that will have immediate security implications, so people will think, okay, safety, my concern. Do you feel climate change is always perceived as not my immediate concern?
Yes, I think there is really a problem there, because people perceive political conflicts in a certain way, and they perceive these other impacts in a completely different way. But I wouldn't say that my writing is intended for that. To remedy that. I write because I'm trying to represent the world as I see it. As I see the reality of the world. That I think is my primary task. And this is the world that we live in. We live in a completely disrupted world where, I saw a television report on these Delhi floods. And there was this lady reporter, and she was saying, how can this happen in the national capital region and so on? And it just shows the sorts of delusions that people live under, that they think because
it'll never happen to us.
It'll never happen to us, and that you have a national capital region, therefore it'll never happen here. Forgetting that the national capital region has an environment just like, any ordinary village or any place anywhere in the world.
Yeah, correct. I was very curious and I wanted to ask you this question. Nutmeg, opium, it feels that, Mr. Ghosh, you use a lot of these motifs to tell your story. Why do you do that? I mean, do you feel that this makes your writing more interesting, or is it always, it gives you some sort of a perspective to, reach to a larger story?
See, there is a sort of myth about modernity that human beings have somehow become self-sufficient, that they're not dependent on the environment, that they exist in some sort of a privileged sphere where they don't have to depend on natural resources. This is completely a delusion. Today, more than ever before, we are completely dependent on nature for everything. I mean, where does oil come from? Oil is nothing but a fossilized forest.
Yeah.
We are more dependent on nature today than ever before. So, in a sense, I suppose one of the things certainly that I wanted to open people's eyes to is the degree of that dependence. And the story of especially of the nutmeg resulted in this terrible resource curse where the people who had nurtured this amazing tree were essentially killed off. And in a way, what we are seeing in the world today is the globalization of the resource curse. So in relation to, this is again the story, a very important aspect of the story of opioids. As against this myth of human invulnerability, etc., the story of opium shows us actually how fragile humans are, how frail they are, how dependent, how easily human societies can fall victim to something as simple as a flower.
I had told our viewers that I'm going to come and interview you, so there are some viewer questions also which we've got. One of them reads, you've been in many countries. How's your experience of their reading and writing culture has been, and habits in the comparison to India?
That's a very interesting question, actually. If I think about the reading and the publishing culture, the evolution of the publishing culture in India, from the beginning of my career as a writer till today, over these 40 years, there's been a complete change. It's unrecognizable, really. With my first book, there were no publishers in India. I took it by hand, to various, around Connaught Place where there were various printers and so on. And today you look, I mean, back in those days, there were hardly any bookshops because books weren't being imported into India. Today there's an enormous increase in the reading culture in India.
But it's surprising that you say that, because this is also a time where people say that, people have moved away from books. You've got the advent of social media where one would like to read everything in 140 characters. So how do you see reading vis-a-vis?
That's again a myth, because in fact the sales of books even in America has continued to increase. Despite all of that, people obviously feel some attachment to reading. So the sales of books has not dropped, oddly enough. And oddly enough, also people are not always buying books from Amazon. Actually, I think in some countries like the UK, etc., Amazon's market share has actually declined. More and more people are going to bookshops. So yes, certainly in India there's been a sea change in the reading culture, publishing culture. And
that's positive news.
Absolutely, yes. Certainly for me. Yes.
There's one more question, and this I think is very, very significant. Cyclones are generally considered a phenomenon of the Bay of Bengal. But in recent years, we have witnessed extreme cyclone and cyclonic activity, for instance, Cyclone Biporjoy, which took place in the Arabian Sea. In your book, The Great Derangement, you talked about the risk of cyclones on Mumbai. Do you feel that you, to quote Gabriel Garcia Marquez, scripted the chronicle of a death foretold?
Well, in fact, climate models show that cyclonic activity is increasing hugely in the Arabian Sea, and that it's going to increase more. So one of the things I wanted to do in my book, The Great Derangement, is to tell people along the West Coast to prepare. In fact, the last 100 years, say 1900 to 2000, were a climatic anomaly, because the Arabian Sea didn't have many cyclones. But historically, the Arabian Sea has also had a lot of cyclones. But unfortunately, because of the Bay of Bengal, the eastern states have developed very complex protocols for dealing with cyclones. The West Coast doesn't have this.
Yeah.
So they are not prepared.
Yeah.
In fact, the state of preparation for Bombay virtually doesn't exist, and Bombay is incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, there is an increase of cyclonic activity in the Arabian Sea by some estimates suggest as high as 50%.
Yeah, and it's going to keep increasing.
Yeah.
And Bombay is a sitting duck, because Bombay has nothing to protect it. At least Calcutta has the mangroves.
Yeah.
It has the Sundarbans.
Correct.
Bombay is just sea facing.
Okay. One more question. This is by a viewer who says your book Living Mountain is of 48 pages, which costs 252 rupees in India. Don't you think it is restricting the access of quality literature to perhaps poor and middle class readers?
These are decisions taken by publishers. I really have nothing to do with them.
But you would want to reach out to more and more
absolutely,
readers,
absolutely, of course.
Yeah. Okay. One more question. Budget 2023-24 speech of Nirmala Sitharaman mentions states will be encouraged to set up physical libraries for them at panchayat and ward levels. Do you think that public libraries have a great role to play in producing good writers in this country, and more should be welcome? And also the relevance of a library in modern India. I don't think we are really hailing our libraries as much as we should.
In the first place,
many libraries are in a state of decay.
Yeah, we don't have many libraries. Actually, it's interesting. I saw today a chart of libraries in India. Kerala alone has like 30% of all of India's libraries. And the second is Bengal, which also has a very large number of libraries. For the rest of India is a library desert. You don't have many libraries.
Climate change. In terms of libraries.
Yes. Unfortunately, people forget that libraries are not just about books. They also provide, a sort of social forum. And in that way, they're very important to communities.
My final question, do you feel, while you were very positive and upbeat about books and their sale, do you feel that there will be a definite resurgence in readers across the world, particularly in a country like India? They'll be interested to go pick up a book and read. And social media can actually be used as a great influence to get people back to reading.
Well, as I said, the paradox is that despite people being so glued to social media and to their screens, I mean, the actual sales of books don't reflect that. The sales of books have continued to increase even in the US and the UK, which historically didn't have such, very intense cultures of reading. But, if you go to China or Southeast Asia or wherever, wherever there are high levels of literacy, on any train in China, everyone is reading a book. Everyone. China has some of the most amazing bookshops I've ever seen. They're hyper modern. They look like satellites. When you go into them, it's like being in a spaceship. Same is true in Southeast Asia. They have amazing bookshops.
What
South
about
Korea.
our bookshops in India?
Well, we have many more bookshops today, and some of them are increasingly nicely designed. But if you see the bookshops of East Asia, it'll just take your breath away.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no comparison.
I wanted to ask you this. I have, through the course of one question, but let me be very direct about this. What do you personally like, fiction or non-fiction? And do you feel fiction gives you some sort of freedom to make your point? Say, for instance, on climate change.
I mean, is your question that what do I like to read or what do I like to write?
What do you like to write? Fiction or non-fiction?
Oh, fiction, definitely.
Huh.
Yeah, I far prefer writing fiction because, as you say, you're much freer. It gives you much more liberty to imagine, to write, to think.
Mr. Ghosh, thank you so much for your time, and here's to many more books. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.